Investors are sounding the alarm, and it's not just noise. There's inflation, tariffs, and sinking consumer confidence, which is all contributing to the perfect storm. But here's the twist. You can profit in this chaos. Now, I've analyzed how the top 1% protect their wealth, especially in downturns. And the data is showing where the smart money is moving today. So with that, let's analyze what's really going on and how you can recession-proof your finances and invest like the wealthy starting today. With that, let's jump right in. Now, what's going on in the world today? We see that the world is a total mess, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on, and in this video, we're going to be talking about how to create a money plan to help you get back up to pace. So what's going on right now in the world? I mean, we've got inflation. Let me actually change the type of my pen here. We've got inflation. The Federal Reserve revised the recession forecast. And there's tariffs. I mean, we've probably heard about tariffs for many months now. Many of us are very likely sick of hearing about tariffs. But in this video, I'm going to be talking about how tariffs can actually impact your money and some of the things that you can expect. Now, in this video, what is my goal? I thought that you'd like this drawing here. This is you. This is you drinking your cup of coffee or tea from your Millennial Money Woman mug because it's nice and purple. And you're reading a newspaper while the world goes crazy. So you see the stock market crashing, everything's going upside down, but you are sitting there relaxed. Why? Because you have a money plan in place and because you understand the economics behind all of these policies that are being put into place. That's the goal of this video, to give you the empowerment and the confidence and the knowledge of what's going on and what you can do to kind of navigate and finesse your way around these different policies. All right, that sounds good. Keep watching because it's fun. It's going to get fun. So first, let's talk about inflation. If this graph here looks familiar to you, that's because it is. I talked about this graph before, but I think it's very, very important to incorporate in this video. It shows two key things. First, wages, so wage growth, and second, inflation, meaning how up or how far up has inflation been over the last 5 years. The black line is inflation and essentially peaked at 9% in mid-2022, as you can see here. The answer, or rather the question, why did it peak so high, is because of COVID, right? During COVID, we had a lot of money pumped into the economy, and the reason why was because of the stimulus goal, meaning the government wanted to provide a stimulus to help unemployed individuals find work, have enough money to pay off their debt, live an okay life at least, without losing so much money. That was the goal of the stimulus money, which worked because unemployment bounced back. There were several positives coming out of it, but one of the drawbacks here was this 9% inflation. The good news is that the downward trend has started in late 2022, 2023, and actually wage growth, the blue line, has actually exceeded or outpaced inflation, which is what we want to see, because that means workers like you and me actually get paid more. Our growth for our wages increases versus inflation, which takes away the purchasing power of our dollar. So this is good news. I also wanted to break this down further into something known as the Consumer Price Index, also known as the CPI. The CPI is essentially very closely related to inflation measures, right? So if we're talking about inflation, oftentimes we're referring to something called the CPI, which is what I'll talk about now. The CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is is one of the leading economic indicators, also known as LEIs, right? So leading economic indicator. These are things or indicators that can help flag or show you a rough direction of where the economy is going right now. So, for example, they might not be perfect predictors of recessions, but at least they give you some sense of, hey, inflation's really high or the CPI is really high, which might result in a recession at some point in the future. The only thing that you want to keep in mind is not to use this CPI in and of itself. Because if that was the case, then at this 9% marker in mid-2022, as we discussed here in this previous graph, right here, if you just use the CPI as a leading economic indicator, then everyone would have been running wild and been saying, oh my goodness, there's a recession around the corner, which wasn't the case, right? So you want to make sure you include the CPI into your calculations or into your estimates, along with many other leading economic indicators, which I did talk about in a previous video. If you're not sure, check that one out. But moving on, this chart I thought was interesting because it actually categorized the CPI into two categories. One, it looked at all items that contribute to inflation. So we're talking utilities, we're talking groceries, we're talking rent, we're talking everything put into one bucket to then measure and calculate inflation or the consumer price index, meaning how costly are goods right now in a period of time. So that's bucket one. Bucket two is this here, this aquamarine dotted line. And that actually takes food and energy out of the equation. So it does not look at food and it does not look at energy, and it looks at everything else to see what the inflation is calculated as. And I think there's something really interesting showing in this chart here. The first thing being all items, right, were super inflated. The prices were really, really high when inflation peaked at 9%. And if we took out food and energy, it was actually, quote, only at about 6% or so. What does this spread tell us, or gap, if you want to call it a gap? The gap tells us that food and energy actually contributed to about 3% of inflation at that point in time, which is quite a bit, right? And we saw that. I mean, I saw it when I went to the market, literally just down the street. I can look at it from my window. And, my eggs were super expensive. My meat or groceries, produce, everything was so expensive during that time. It still is, to be honest. But let's not get into that. The point is, the food and energy was really expensive because of the spread here, which you can see. But now take a look. In 2025, I'm going to zoom in here. We actually see that this spread, this difference, is actually narrowing and converging. It's almost one. So all items at inflation is 3%, and the food is actually 3.3%. So the difference went from a 3% difference here to almost the same. So I thought that was very interesting, which means that as we converge, there's not one category that is extremely inflated, like food and energy, for instance, over another category. So overall, this is good news. It means that we're coming closer to an equilibrium. One category is not overpriced compared to another. This chart is why I wanted to show this idea to you. All right, let's also take a look at a couple of other items, I think, that kind of show what's going on with inflation. Again, this shows all items. So all items currently, as of January 2025, are at 3% inflation. Food at home, about 2%. Food away from home, 3.4%. I know that. If I go out to eat, oh my goodness, I wish I didn't go out to eat because it's so expensive, at least where I live. And then all items less food and energy is 3.3%, which relates back to this chart here, 3.3%. This makes sense. Okay, food at home, I mean, eggs, enough said. I don't think I need to say anymore. 53% inflation, but other food isn't that highly inflated, which is good news. So, just take a look at this chart. I thought it was interesting to at least include the numbers here. Energy has been plus 1%, and then it kind of breaks down what's going on in the energy market. It looks like gas service is almost 5% inflation as of January 25 when this graph was printed. All items less food and energy. So again, this does not include food and energy. Everything else, we look at video discs and other media. That's interesting. Maybe because of supply chain shortages still, or something to do with chips. I don't know. I'm just kind of guessing, talking out loud, if you will. So we see a lot of these. And then, all right, cool. Interesting. I also wanted to show you these charts here. Let me go up here. 12-month percentage change of the CPI, also known again for inflation, like helping you understand inflation measures in selected categories. So I just thought this was interesting because you can see how food and energy prices or inflation have changed over time. And this year is as of 2015, actually. And this is from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, which you can find right here. If you click on this link, it will actually show you the change over the last 10, 15 years. I think it's really fascinating. I would suggest you check this out. This is just a screenshot, so it's static, but I do highly recommend you check it out. This year, also from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, very interesting because, again, it shows the CPI change. And it also illustrates why it's an LEI, a leading economic indicator. Anytime, so wherever you see this gray bar, this shows a recession. And generally speaking, maybe not so much here, but generally speaking, there is, I guess even here, there is a typical uptick in prices, in inflation, before you go into a recession. You don't really know when, right? Because here we had a massive uptick up to 9%, which is the highest it's been in several decades, honestly. But there was no recession. So again, take this with a grain of salt, but I think it's good data to have, right? And so this here I thought was also interesting. This is the average price of different types of items over time. So again, this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This here's a screenshot, but if you're really interested to see how bananas per pound have changed over time, or electricity or eggs would be an interesting one. You can go to this website and it's all available for the public to use and see. And you can see how the price of eggs has changed over time, for instance. Maybe don't look at it because it would infuriate you. I don't know, but it's just something to know that it's there. All right, another really cool chart I wanted to show you is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, for some categories, right? So we're looking at food, we're looking at energy, and all items less food and energy. So we can see how these have fluctuated, especially energy prices here, which is in the red, over time. Food also has had some fluctuations over the last 10 years or so. So again, interesting chart, good to know. I think this is also interesting because it shows how inflation has been impacted in different areas or different cities. So some cities have been more so impacted than others. Interestingly enough, I believe, if I remember correctly from my readings, the South, which is the green here, so the South of the United States, has been impacted more in a negative way by inflation. So that's interesting. All right, so what does inflation actually lead to? We just really took some time to analyze these numbers, go into depth where inflation is impacting what areas of the country, and that the convergence is coming back down. What does that actually lead to? First, reduced purchasing power, and we talked about that, right? When $1 does not buy the same amount of goods as it did 2 years ago or 5 years ago. Higher costs of living. We know that too because if we live in cities or really anywhere in the United States or other parts of the world, as the years go on and inflation increases, then it just costs more to live. Rent goes up, but my apartment doesn't get any better. Like, I just got a notice that my rent is going up by a few $100s, and I'm thinking, am I getting like an extra service? Am I getting, I don't know, some sort of extras into my apartment? No, I'm not, but the rent still goes up. Welcome to cost of living, unfortunately. Wage pressure. So this means salary increases. That's good for workers like you and me. Erosion of savings. This is not good. So next time you look into your savings account, maybe the balance has gone down, which is not ideal, right? Maybe the balance has gone down because the cost of living has gone up. Typically, these two are inversely correlated. When one goes up, like the cost of living, the other, your savings, goes down, and vice versa. And then business uncertainty, especially if there's a lot of inflation. Some businesses might hesitate to hire more workers. Why? Because there's an expected increase in salary, which means businesses might have to spend more money on workers, and they don't really want to do that to preserve their profits. And the list goes on. So these are just some of the top 5 resulting reasons that inflation could lead to. Now, the second thing is tariffs. And we've heard about tariffs a lot, at least I have. It's something you can consider being the stealth tax, right? So a tariff, to even explain what it is, it's essentially a tax, right? It's like a tax that's imposed on a good that is imported or exported. And so it can go both ways, but let's kind of look at this more in the broad and general sense. So how do tariffs actually impact you and businesses, producers or businesses, consumers, or you and me? So it discourages foreign countries or businesses from selling products in the foreign country. So, for example, it might discourage car manufacturers in Europe, for instance, from selling their cars and products in the United States because they're the tariffs, right? The price would be higher. It would increase prices, right? So that's literally what I just said. It would increase prices of these products, which means there's, for the consumer, fewer choices of goods. If there's less cars being brought into the United States, that means there's less options, there's less availability, less variety, which could be a good thing or a bad thing, right? It depends on your own preference. And then consumer quality. Typically, if there's less choice, then the prevailing or the dominant producers in the country might say, okay, well, the consumers, they're forced to buy my product. There's less competition for me. So now I don't have to put all the bells and whistles onto the car, and I can reduce the quality, save money, and still maybe sell at the same price. Essentially what I did before, just with less bells and whistles on the product. So that is not good for the consumer either. So right away, you can see a couple of trends forming, which we'll talk about in a little more depth here in a couple of minutes, which consumers typically don't see the same surplus as they did before. Producers, the companies, the manufacturers, on the other hand, typically do see a surplus. And we'll talk about this in economic terms. Okay, so what's currently actually going on? Now that you got a little primer of what a tariff actually is, let's talk about what's happening right now in the United States. So a 25% tariff is likely going to be put in place on foreign cars. And it sounds like it will likely hit kind of the bigger companies, right? So the bigger car manufacturers, that's likely what it's going to hit. But who actually pays? That's the question. Yeah, it will hit the manufacturers and the companies, but most of the time it's you, in other words, the consumer, who will pay. And I put a little sad face because the consumer doesn't want to pay more, right? For the same product, just like I'm paying more for my same apartment. Nothing's changed. The view's the same. I'm not getting anything, but my price increases. This is a little bit different, but you get the point. So why do you pay more? The reason why you pay more is because when companies get taxed more, they actually pass the cost on to consumers like you and me. And here's a quick illustration. If taxes increases, then the price increases for you. So the company doesn't want to take a hit. They're saying, all right, we're going to make Sally or Bob or whoever take the hit, because if they're going to buy this product, we're just going to jack up the prices for them. That's the thought process. So let's actually go into the economics of this. I think it's fascinating. So this here, for those of you who are not familiar, is a very bare bones framework of how the law of supply and demand work in basic economics, right? And this helps, hopefully, you understand a little bit more on how tariffs can actually impact you, the consumer, and the car manufacturers in this example, which are known as the producer. So this point here where both curves intersect is called the equilibrium, right? So this is where, ideally, in theory, the market is perfect. This is exactly where the demand, so here's the demand curve, what you and I are willing to pay for a car, for example, and this is the supply curve. So these are actually cars, right? So this is where they're sold. This is the quantity of cars sold. And this here is the price of the cars. And this here, right here, is for one car. Let's say we're willing to pay, I don't know, $30,000 for this one car. This is the equilibrium. This is where the market is. This is where ideally everything gets bought and sold at the same time. Now, if this here is the price of the world, right? So this is the price of the world. And let's say the price of the world is below the equilibrium. What does that typically mean? It means that people like you and me, I mean, I'm always looking for a deal. I would probably go and buy a car that's not produced domestically, that's produced outside of the country. Why? Because the price, according to this, is lower, right? It's lower than the equilibrium price. This here is where the price would be, I'm going to say P0, of the original, the equilibrium. But if the price of the world is much lower, I'll probably buy from outside of the country. That's the thought process there. Okay, but now if a tariff gets put into place, what happens? You have the price of the world, right? So price of world plus the tariff, whatever the tariff is. If the tariff is like, I don't know, 10% or whatever, 10%, what was our original price? We said $30,000. Okay, so 10%, that's $3,000. So now we're looking at $33,000. That's the total price. And I mean, $3,000 is a lot of money, right? And so all of a sudden, my car is $3,000 more than what it was before when I was buying at the price of the world. That's how tariffs work. They push this line up. It's getting closer to the equilibrium, which is great, but it's still much, much higher than what it originally was at the price of the world, which is not what I want. I want to buy what the world sells for. I don't want to buy what the tariff sells for. So now here's a visualization. This here is without a tariff. So without a tariff, there's something called, and we kind of talked about this, the consumer surplus. So this is how much money and stuff do you get for your dollar? And this here is how it originally used to be, this purple triangle, right? So this purple triangle here is how much you get for your dollar. What is the bang for your buck? Exactly this purple triangle. That's your consumer surplus. This little triangle here, this here is the producer surplus. This is what the companies make in terms of profit. This is before the tariff goes into place. Now look what happens when the tariff goes into place. So the price of the world plus whatever the tariff is, right? It moves this green line up. Well, what happens? Let's zoom out a little bit and see what happens to the purple triangle. The purple triangle actually decreases in size, right? Because this green line was pushed up. So the consumer surplus is now, the consumer surplus goes down. So you and I actually don't get as much value out of the thing that we're buying. Why? Because it's more expensive. The same product, the same car, just at a higher price. And the producers, these companies, the manufacturers, so the producer surplus, or their profits in general, are actually increasing. Why? Because of the taxes, because the price goes up. So again, it gets passed down to you. That's where the logic comes from. When people say tariffs, oh, well, tariffs aren't going to hurt the company. Tariffs are going to hurt you, the consumer. This is exactly the economic theory of where this idea comes from. It will hurt you, very likely. And so, yeah, you know, who wins? The government wins. They make tax revenue. There's loss right here. You don't really need to know this, you know, but in general, what you need to understand, at least I think it's important, is the producers, the car manufacturers, they make more money. And unfortunately, the value to you, the consumer, this purple triangle, decreases. That's the thought process. So what happens with tariffs? Increased government revenue. We saw that. Decrease in consumer surplus, especially when there are no cheaper alternatives. So this gets back to the theory that there's lower consumer quality in the country. If there's more tariffs, that means there's less products coming in, which means the existing car manufacturers in the country might not have to produce such high quality cars because people are still going to buy them probably at the same price or higher. So we get a decrease in consumer surplus. And then an example here to simplify it, if you're used to buying a $500 laptop, if there's a 25% tariff on that, one $500 laptop, well, guess what? That translates to $125 in taxes, which now means your laptop costs $625. So again, it goes up in price to you. And then an increase in producer surplus, domestic manufacturers. And we saw that in the graph too. They benefit because tariffs make foreign imports more expensive, right? So any car that comes in from outside of the US will have an increase in price, which allow firms to raise prices and increase profit margins here. So again, the producer, the manufacturer makes money. So that is this is the inflation and the tariff piece. We just spoke about those two. Now let's talk about consumer sentiment. Overall, it has been shrinking. People generally feel the economy isn't great. I mean, just ask your next door neighbor or your friend, right? Most people feel that the economy isn't good, which typically leads people to spend less money. which also causes companies to not have that much profit, right? So less confidence, less shopping, slower economy. It's that simple. So consumer sentiment hits the lowest level since November 2022, and this year's early 25, as you can see here. So this is another leading LEI, leading economic indicator. Again, as consumer sentiment drops, you'll likely see, as in this gray bar here and here, there might be a recession. Again, this is not the only leading economic indicator you should be looking at to determine if there is a recession. You need to take all of them into account and then some. But this again shows that people aren't feeling too hot about the economy. So in general, how do you know if this leading economic indicator is flashing red and like warning signs? If the reading is 80 or lower. So right now, 80, a reading of 80 is here. And it's at what? A reading of, I don't know exactly what, but it's like 55. That's pretty low if you're asking me. So yeah, there's a potential red flag as an economic indicator. So, all right, we just talked a lot about tariffs, inflation, and consumer sentiment. What does this mean for you? How does it affect you? First of all, increased inflation. It means the money buys less, and it means that credit card debt can increase. Your income is decreasing and your expenses are increasing. This is not good. We don't want that. So how do you start moving your smart money just like the wealthy are? The first is gold. So gold has been rising. It's typically a safe haven, especially when there's volatility. And typically you see a sharp increase in gold prices just before a recession. Again, the recession is highlighted by this dark gray line. Once again, we're seeing a very sharp increase, actually almost an exponential increase in the value of gold prices here very recently. This year's in 2025, this graph. So pretty sharp increase. And again, gold and real gold, you can see this 10-year US Treasury rates. There's a massive spread right now, very big difference. So the gold price has, like I said, exponentially increased recently. So this could be one. If tariffs are going to be a thing of the present, then manufacturing might actually experience a boom in the US. So companies might move factories back to the United States from outside because they can avoid tariffs, and they might be able to produce products in a less expensive fashion. So there's a new demand for, or potentially at least, a new demand for logistics, construction, and supply chain jobs. Again, this all comes back to tariffs, centralizing all these companies, moving back to the US because they don't want to pay these expensive tariffs and then pass down the price to the consumers, probably not going to buy their products in the first place. And then finally, consumer fear. So budget stores are probably going to be a pretty big winner, right? So if you can invest in one of those, it might help, like Dollar Tree, Walmart, things like that. I mean, I sure go to these budget stores, especially when my eggs are so expensive. I'm not happy about that. So how do you take action? First, you want to build a money system. So I typically split my money into 3 buckets, and I recommend you at least think about doing the same. Whenever you have your monthly income, you want to divide it into your spend bucket, 50%. That's the maximum. I typically recommend much less, but let's say 50% for now. Your saving bucket and your investing bucket. The thing here, though, that you see is that saving and investing is also 50%, which is super helpful. And this is how you build long-term wealth, right? Again, the formula for building wealth isn't actually that complicated. It's just the follow through, like actually committing to it and actually getting it done. That's typically the tough part. Kill bad debt. Please do this. If you're carrying debt, specifically credit card debt, right? Please try to kill it off. Get rid of it, pay it off ASAP. The average APR is 18 to 25%. Please stop carrying it. Make sure you pay it off. If you're still worried or thinking about it, watch my previous video on, I talk a lot about credit card debt. So make sure you check that out. And then invest. Again, I know this sounds very common sense, but oftentimes it's not that common, believe it or not. So especially when there's fear, and if the market goes down, that's a perfect time to buy the dip, as people say. Oftentimes people do it the reverse. So this here is what not to do. Let me just write that here. What not to do. Many times when the markets go up, people start getting greedy and they want to buy. And then when the markets goes down, then people are worried, oh my God, I'm going to lose everything. and then they sell. You want to do the opposite here, okay? Because this here is the formula for getting broke, for losing your money. You want to sell typically, or at least hold on to your money. And then here you want to hold on to your money and buy more, right? That's the thought process. You want to do the opposite. If you have extra cash available, like from a bonus or something like that, dollar cost average that cash into solid investments, not speculative, solid long-term investments. Again, when others panic, you should prepare. That is how the wealthy build wealth. Again, it's not rocket science, but I think it's important to at least put this on paper and make sure I explain it. The key is start building wealth today, especially during these storms that we are seeing approach every single day, closer and closer. If you found this helpful, please like and share to help others. I bet they'll appreciate it, as will I. And subscribe to my YouTube channel, _MMW, for more cool insights. And then join my newsletter for more exclusive tips. The link is below in the description. Your bank accounts will thank you later. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.